Hi, guys. We're going to talk about World War One today. As you may know, World War One took place from 1914 to 1918. So we are still in the midst of the 100th year anniversary of World War One. It went on over 100 years ago today. So um, it seems like such a long time ago, but the world after World War One we live in today. It created the world we live in today in many ways. It was called the Great War, and if you think about it, um, there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, now we call it World War One because we know there was a World War Two. But at the time, this was simply one of the greatest wars the human race ever saw. It was one of the most destructive wars in human history. More people died during World War One, both civilian and military, than in any other war in history. So it was a really tragic war, um, and people still argue today why it happened. But I'm going to try to give you some reasons why it happened. So it was called the Great War. There were over 20 million killed during World War One. 20 million. Now, World War II is going to see much more destruction, but at this time in history, that's a lot of deaths. Um, it was a really terrible, terrible war. You know, a lot of times young people, especially young boys, when you talk about war, they get really excited. They like war. Um, that's really unfortunate because World War One was really awful, and most of the people who were a part of it said as much. They said it was really, really terrible. Both C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia Chronicles, and J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Hobbit and other books, were in this war. They both served in this war, and they both were injured in this war. And neither one of them thought it was a beautiful thing. Neither one of them thought it was something um, good. It was something I think they thought that was necessary, but it was a really, really ugly affair. And they did not really celebrate it. Most people after World War One, all throughout the world, were just totally shocked and upset because they thought, how could the human race do this? Um, I don't know if I've mentioned to you guys in this class, but there was a saying at the turn of the century in 1900. People were saying that in the next 100 years, the human race is going to get rid of war, we're going to get rid of poverty, and we're going to get rid of disease. Well, here we go. In the next 100 years, they had the worst war in human history. And many people were scratching their heads and saying, what happened? Why did we have such an awful, destructive war? Many, many people were really upset that this could happen. Um, Let me try to talk very briefly about why the war happened. And I'm basically going to boil it down to one thing, and that is people stopped believing in God. Because people stopped believing in God, there were lots of ideas in Europe at the time: communism, various kinds of atheism, um, various other belief systems that were saying, oh, there is no God. Because people stopped believing in God, they needed to believe in something. They needed something bigger than themselves to believe in. And so, what many people think is that since people didn't have God to believe in anymore, they were not believing in God, they began to believe in their country. They began to believe, well, I'm a Serbian and I want to have a Serbian country for the Serbs, and we're going to be great and we're going to be better than the other countries. Um, Historians call this nationalism. It's really just a fancy word for patriotism, but patriotism almost made like a religion. Patriotism made like God. Think of it if you almost worshiped your country as God. That's what was happening in Europe. More and more people thought of their country as the most important thing there was, and they were going to live and die to make their country great. So you can imagine if all these different nations in Europe were all thinking our country's the best, and we need to do whatever we can do to make it like it used to be or like it could be. Usually that meant taking back land from other people and other places. So many people say nationalism was a cause of the war. The other thing you have to keep in mind is as this nationalism spread throughout Europe, many countries were aware that other countries were thinking this way. Other countries were aggressive. Other countries were talking about taking land that used to belong to them or other things. And so um, they call this entangling alliances. And I compare it to this. I don't know if you've ever done this when you play a game like Risk. But when I used to play Risk, various players would say, hey, let's get together, you and me. We won't attack one another. And if anybody else attacks you, I'll attack them. This is not in the official rules of Risk, but this is something a lot of people do. Well, what began to happen all over Europe is every nation was making alliances with other nations because they were all worried about everybody being aggressive. And they were all saying, well, listen, if anybody attacks, let's make a treaty. And if anybody attacks you, I'll attack them, and so on and so forth. So you have to keep in mind, everybody all over Europe is connected to some other nation where they've said, okay, we're going to work together. And if anybody attacks you, I'll declare war against them. So the actual event that sparks the war, as many of you may know, was a Serbian who's from a region in the Balkan Peninsula, who the Serbians believe they should have their own nation, attacked the leader of the nation of Austria-Hungary. This is what used to be the Holy Roman Empire. It's one nation, Austria-Hungary. Their leader, Archduke Francis Ferdinand, was assassinated as he went on a parade. Now, I should just comment on real quickly, he knew that there were going to be assassination attempts. And he said, oh, it's no big deal, let's just go. And there were actually 3 or 4 other assassination attempts on the parade route. And they didn't just say, this is crazy, let's get out of here. So at any rate, it's a real tragedy that it happened in the first place. But when Archduke Francis Ferdinand was assassinated, that triggered a domino effect of all these other countries saying, hey, we need to declare war on them, and we need to declare war on them. And pretty soon, almost all of Europe was entangled in a large declaration of war. Let's talk about the 2 big sides. There were many, many other smaller countries on each side, but I'm just going to mention the big players. So the Allies, they're called the Allies by us because we eventually joined the war. So the Allies were France, Britain, and Russia. And if you're paying attention or you know much about World War II, those countries were allies in World War II as well. What you may not know is that Japan and Italy were also on the side of the Allies in World War I. Now in World War II, they're obviously on the other side. And then, of course, we joined the war late in the war. We joined in 1917. The Central Powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which is more or less in Turkey, so that region. Okay, well, I'm not going to get into the sort of the progress of the war or the blow-by-blow of the war. Let me just mention that it is considered one of our first really modern wars, and I'll explain why that is. Had a lot of modern technology. So, for example, it was one of the first wars to use tanks. The tanks were certainly not as advanced as they eventually get, but they were a major part of the war. This is one of the first wars that airplanes played a role. They played nowhere near the role that they will play in World War II. These were the biplanes, and so you have the Red Baron and various other famous pilots of planes. The planes, again, didn't play as much of a role as they will later on. They weren't dropping large amounts of bombs like they do in World War II, but they're beginning to play a role. Probably the worst thing about World War I was the chemical weapons. There were various weapons, mustard gas being the one, where they would shoot a bomb off and it would release this gas, and this gas, if you didn't have a gas mask, would burn your lungs up, and you would suffocate. So it was really awful because of chemical warfare. One of the sort of symbols of the war is these gas masks that every soldier needed to have. And maybe if I'm in class sometime, I'll tell you what you could do in a pinch if you didn't have a gas mask to save yourself. It's pretty gross, but if you're willing to save your life, if you're willing to do this gross thing to save your life, you can save your life. There were machine guns in this war. There were also submarines in this war, although war at sea wasn't where most of the fighting took place. Most of the fighting took place in Europe and parts of the Middle East and some of Africa. Also, machine guns. Probably the greatest symbol of the war, though, is the trench warfare, where two sides would fight and eventually they would get dug in. And you'd have this area in between where the fighting took place. There'd be barbed wire put up. And as the fighting went on, eventually there was nothing left. Not a blade of grass, not a tree. It was just mud. One of the big problems being in the trenches was trench foot. You'd be down in those trenches and they'd be muddy and wet and you'd have boots on. And eventually your feet would get really nasty, get fungus, and you'd have this rotting foot problem. So it was really gruesome. Another big problem was rats. There were just rats everywhere in the trenches with the dead and everything else. So very, very gruesome war. A very, very costly war. So as I said, the war goes on from 1914 to 1917, and the United States didn't get involved. And I should comment here that the United States had a long-standing tradition going all the way back to Washington, where we said, we need to not get involved in problems in the world that don't have to do with us. So George Washington believed that we needed to be neutral in a lot of major issues. In particular, later presidents said in the Monroe Doctrine that Europe should involve itself in our hemisphere, and we won't involve ourselves in the European hemisphere. So we had a long-standing policy of not getting involved. The particular events that get us involved are that Germany appeared to be trying to get Mexico to ally with Germany. And Germany was basically saying, hey, Mexico, if you'll ally with us, remember those alliances before the war? Well, this was during the war. They said, if you'll ally with us and attack the United States when the war is over, we'll help you finish the job. A message sent from Germany to a German ambassador or to a Mexican ambassador was intercepted by the United States. And basically we discovered Germany was trying to get one of our neighbors to declare war on us. Well, we thought that was a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, so we got involved in the war. Now, I'd like to point out, though, we did get involved in the war and we did play an important role, but our casualties compared with most European countries was very small. So let me just give you this statistic. We had 53,000 combat deaths. So 53,000 American soldiers were killed in combat compared to 1.7 million for Russia and 1.4 million for France. So countries like France, countries like Russia, Great Britain, they saw a lot more cost as a result of World War I.